nine, eight, seven, six, five, four, three, two, one.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our investor panel. My name is Mahesh Narayanan. I'm one of the venture partners at Newchip Accelerator, and I would like to welcome you all to our demo day. And we have a great panel today of investors that invest across the board, but focusing primarily in the life sciences today. And I would like to introduce both Mr. James Lee and Mr. Aljit Joy. Mr. Lee, please go ahead and introduce yourself, your fund, and brief background about yourself.
Okay, I guess I'll start. I'm associated with a fund called Photon Fund. We are early stage investor. Fund is set up in Silicon Valley, but I'm actually in Boston. So we're mainly looking at entire United States per se, but a lot of predominantly invest a lot of company around Berkeley. And we're starting to spending out some other geography in the US. And two sectors that we are not very interested. One is biotech, life science. The other one is deep tech. So life science, biotech usually is like therapeutics drug or drug delivery or rapid diagnosis. And the other sector, deep tech, usually is something like semiconductor, narrow material or semiconductor software, that type of company. And early meanings preclinical or pre-huge revenue. And my background is also semiconductor, and done my first stuff fresh out of school, 2008, 2009. That was not the time to enjoy when you are working in a startup, but we managed to survive eventually IPO in 2014. But this couple of years is very echo me back to the memory of 08, 09. And I really hope that I can provide some insight that will be helpful.
Aljit, please go ahead and introduce yourself, the fund that you represent, as well as a small background of yourself.
Sure. My name is Aljit Joy, and I am a managing director for a company called CIRQUARE, which is an early stage investment firm, primarily looking at post-seed, pre-series A type of deals. I would say that's kind of the rule of thumb, but we sometimes do find some seed deals that are interesting, and sometimes some post-series A or series A type stuff that are interesting as well. We invest across sectors. I come from a technology background, having spent a lot of time at Comcast, running Comcast Innovation Lab, starting that. But so a fair amount of time in technologies, industrial IoT, enterprise software, but also life sciences and clean tech and clean energy are kind of the companies that are in my portfolio right now. So definitely a pretty interesting space across all of those verticals, but energy, tech, life sciences are kind of the key areas that we look at.
Okay, excellent. So as this panel, a lot of things are going virtual, and I'm sure many of your meetings have also moved virtually. So I'd love to get your ideas on how COVID-19 has affected your communications, and how the transition to virtual meetings has taken place within your fund. So we'll start with James, and then we'll go to Aljit.
Okay, so I guess we have been really rely on the Zoom meeting a lot, but in general, not just Zoom, Google Hangout or some other tools. So I would say there's more meeting because the way I see it, we can leverage the time that we're saving from commute, but really have more meeting with a peer investor and also meeting with the team. And I think that's pretty much all around the board, the peer we start meet with. We have more meeting actually, but I might want to suggest a couple different tricks. One is, of course, there is a formal meeting due diligence call. And I think that it would be really helpful to have a founder to show their personality by setting things like a show, like Zoom coffee chat, or like a online happy hour, grab a beer or wine. That means there's more of our work, but I think investors won't really care, at least for most of the investors that I met with. And some other thing I can suggest is more introduce investor to more of your reference. For example, put in get to know a founder in person is harder, but we will have to rely on a lot of reference. So that's a couple of things I can think of on top of my head.
Thank you. And I know, at least many of the companies that you invest in, they're pre-revenue and preclinical. So a lot of that is based around the team, that you're really investing in the team. So Aljit, I'd love to get your idea on, as a angel investor, how that has changed compared to a more institutional VC, how that has changed the interaction between smaller teams and in smaller companies. As an angel investor, how has your experience been moving those type of meetings to a virtual communication?
Sure. I think for the first part, from sourcing deals, sourcing companies, I've been involved in 3 or 4 different networks through which I am able to see several different companies. So while the networks aren't physically meeting together, they've all been replaced by Zoom twice a month in one case, once a month in the other case. So the presentations of companies is still happening. I think what's missing is the networking aspect of those meetings when it used to happen in person, either networking with other fellow investors. So a lot of the deals that you may hear about outside of those presentations, that, oh, I saw a company here, you should take a look at it. We don't see a lot of that happening as frequently because you're not there in person. So I think I've been in a couple of Zoom or networking type events where there are networking software or platforms that are being used right now to do post-presentation discussions and networking. So I think there's a need for that, where it still feels a little fabricated, but we need to, how do we get networking to be more natural, where it's not just the one-to-one presentations or the one-to-many presentations that a CEO is pitching the company, but the interactions that he used to have with other fellow investors or in the room is probably pretty heavily missed right now. But I think on the deal and just meeting companies hasn't gone down at all. You can still meet the same number of companies because even in those individual meetings, you're getting somebody to present to you. Zoom kind of takes the place of that. Q&A with the founders is fine, but I think the informal collection, gathering of companies and hearing about companies and discussions about what's happening is probably gone in this very efficient mode of Zoom and Hangouts, where somebody presents, somebody asks Q&A, and you're done. So you don't get that part of it.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just follow up to that, and I'll come to James as well with the same question. What has been successful for companies, since a large part of interaction with investors had been both formal and informal, and many of the informal aspects have left? What has been successful for companies, in your perspective, that have helped them at least go raise some money or go finish the deal? Again, I'll start with Aljit and then I'll come to James.
Yeah, I would say in terms of what I've seen in terms of due diligence phase of companies, where typically you hear multiple investors' perspectives and answers to all of those. It takes a little longer if I may forget a question or not. It takes a little longer to get those answers. But in where I've seen them be successful, companies be successful, where the CEO proactively sends reports out and updates on what's happening. Here's what's happening on our funding. Here's what's happening with the competitors. Anything that was missing, it doesn't matter who asked the question. As an angel investor, the good ones are kind of summarizing all of those and sharing with all the investors, and not just the 1 or 2 questions I answered. So I think it helps to fill out the whole picture for an investor when they see all aspects of those responses and questions that are being answered during due diligence. So I would say the time frame for due diligence has increased, but where I've found things to be better is where CEOs are pretty proactive and very comprehensive in their updates, whether it's monthly or quarterly updates, especially in times of COVID. I think I've seen some companies take on the burden of, will do multiple updates just to make sure that all our stakeholders are informed. So whether it's a company pre-funding or company post-funded, I think extra communication is something that I've seen as being beneficial, because there's more information that's provided to me with which I can make decisions or connect the company to customers or next stage investors, etc. So I would say an extra set of a little more communications and more comprehensive, just to be on the safe side and making sure all your stakeholders are informed.
Sure. And when you say more comprehensive, did you mean is more detailed reports, or do you want more of a? Now, I've seen multiple companies actually do a monthly or a bi-monthly video call where they pretty much just record an update and then they send it out to everyone, all the investors. I mean, what do you mean by comprehensive? Like, how detailed do you really want?
I would say it's not detailed in terms of pages of reports. It's more detailed in terms of covering multiple areas. Here's where we're in customers. Here's where we're in funding. Here's where we are. I'm just hitting out the high levels of all areas, and then because what it does for me is investors have different set of questions, but doesn't mean that other areas are not important. It's just that they may not have had a question. So when you have a Q&A, I may ask my one question, but I'm interested in more than just that one area. It's not just your financings, your fund, your cash situation that I care about, but how are you doing on customer, winning customers? Is there something I can help with?
James, anything you want to add to that? Anything different that you feel with the companies that you have either invested in or have looked at that they did something successfully that helped them close the deal?
Yeah, so I certainly agree with what all of the Aljit mentioned. I don't think I can add more, but maybe I will add something a little more on top of that. Is not only update to the investor, but also your pitch deck. You will have to make sure you have the plan to embrace this uncertainty, right? If you don't have at least a page or two talk about the impact from COVID-19 and how are you going to adopt this new norm, and how are you going to mitigate the risk of if there's a second wave hits. For us, the conversation won't go too far because we feel there's a lot of uncertainty here. You need to understand and embrace it and make a plan around it. So that's probably the only one thing I will add. Other than that, I certainly agree with what Aljit mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that leads up to the next question really well, which is, I feel like biotech and life sciences in general has been one of the few industries that hasn't been affected too much by the pandemic, because biotech has always been a long-term play. We're not going to get a product tomorrow and get revenue the day after. It's always going to be, long timelines for development, long times for regulatory processes, and then, hopefully a big payday in the end. So James, can you expand on how companies that you have invested in already, or you've seen other life science companies, how their business development processes and fundraising processes have changed because of COVID-19, and how that actually has, in fact, affected how they're planning to move forward as a company? Yeah,
so I guess it could come down to more like three levels. The first level is you have to make sure you don't do things like a pulse check, right? What is your runway? How is everything with your vendor, your supplier, and your customer? And we have been really helping our portfolio company also when there's a new investment opportunity. We'll also really focus on what have they done to do this type of level, the ground truth check. Where are you at in terms of finance and also customer revenue? That's first level. The second level is once you figure it out, do this vital sign check. You will have to figure it out what will be a real impact from this, right? In terms of your company, also your vendor and your customer, and trying to come up with the strategy in terms of more like defense or offense type of strategy, right? If that's really hard, hit you pretty bad, you probably want to extend your runway. You probably have to react quickly to get a PPP loan, maybe think about pay cut over there or whatever, right? And also asking help from the investor. But if it's actually benefit from you, there's a certain angle that you can play with, then you should have a plan and make sure you can execute it. And the next level, I think we already mentioned, more like embrace uncertainty. You have to, at higher level, look at further out what happened with the second hit. You mentioned about life science. Actually, life science, the only thing I would say is lab work. You cannot do it over the room, right? You still have to do it in the lab. And then, for example, the clinic site selection, CRO, of type, you will have to really diversify, really not put everything in single buckets. For example, one of the portfolio company that we invest is single source supplier in China. Back in March, February, everything stopped. It was pretty bad for them, right? So they come up with a second strategy, have diversified to some other places, and also starting to select the clinical side in different geography in terms of putting on the same area. So all type of thing you can show in your management style and also a long-term thinking and strategy. I think that's couple things like these three levels must have to be in your business development process. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And Aljit, same question to you. What have you seen that has really affected the companies that you have invested in or are in your portfolio by COVID-19, and how have their business development processes changed moving forward, at least as long as we have a pandemic around?
In the life sciences space, I think one interesting company is what they've done is, to with James's point about certain things that have to be done in the office in terms of labs or testing. They've taken a approach to take turns to be in the office. So there's 100% coverage with social distancing, with all the necessary precautions. And they've been operating like that since March. They're in California, and they've been doing a phenomenal job. So they don't bring everybody in, but they've been taking turns. So they've actually been able to continue on their path. They're actually right now doing an FDA submission. So there's a bunch of different things that they've had to do for 510K clearance, et cetera, that is still going according to plan. But they're not all virtual. They've taken, for things that have to be in person, they've taken turns to kind of maintain 100% continuity. In a non-life science environment, I've seen companies that have been kind of 100% remote. But the challenges there also are where they're having to meet customers. Sales has been, it's not challenging, but it's just changed. You're not meeting them in person. You're not taking them out to lunch or breakfast. You're now doing everything over Zoom. So they tend to be very, very formal in almost all these things because you don't have a catch-up conversation over lunch or coffee anymore. So, but people are managing to do it. I think so in the kind of the tech space, there is that, but again, the buying decisions for enterprises have also been delayed or paused or deferred into next year. So companies that are targeting the enterprise space have to be aware of those and manage their internal costs and burn to that extent. And then I have another company that has had to manage significantly their burn and their costs and restructure the company, have to let go of some folks as well. And now in the process of pivoting to a slightly different version because they are exposed heavily to the travel space. And travel doesn't look like it's recovering right now. And as James mentioned, if there's a second wave, travel is going to be pushed out very far out. So travels, meetings, et cetera, corporate meetings, et cetera, that are, I don't know when the next corporate conference will ever happen in person. So companies and that kind of supply or targeting those areas are really looking at pivoting or changing their approach to kind of how they look at stuff. So I've seen, companies that are, active and not dropping the ball at all the way to having to pivot and make changes in their staff significantly, as well as change their complete strategy as well.
Okay, no, perfect. I think both of those are very relevant to not just life science companies, but as you mentioned, non-life science companies. Many of them are going completely virtual, and that's changed many of their plans moving forward. So I think a lot of relevant aspects there. And the final question I wanted to ask both of you, and one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you both, is that you have both been very active investors in life sciences even throughout the pandemic. And that hasn't always been the case for many other investors. There are some investors that have pretty much pulled back all of their potential investments to make sure they can safeguard their current portfolio and make sure the companies that they're already invested in have enough money to keep going. So can you tell me what has led you to keep going throughout the pandemic, and what are some success stories you've had in terms of investments that you made in the past 6 months or so since the pandemic started that you feel very good about, and would love to hear some. You don't have to give the full details, but how you went about making those investments.
And this is not a life science company, but I would say I was talking to a life science kind of a company that's focused around several sort of services in the pet space earlier in the year. And even with COVID starting, it's interesting that pets are a recession-proof industry or a downturn-proof industry. And we've seen more people go and get pets during this time because they're at home and they found that it's a great time to adopt a pet. So that's a space that was hot before COVID, and it's even more hot in terms of people looking for pet-related products and services after COVID hit. So that's been a pretty interesting company in terms of how they're doing. So that's an investment we made. I'm right now evaluating a couple of companies in the life sciences space, and the due diligence is dragged out, as I mentioned earlier, it's dragged out a little longer, and partly because everything else is in terms of what they're doing is also dragged out, whether it's other funding, whether it's FDA approvals, whether it's FDA submissions, etc. It's just little milestones that I've been looking forward to before I make an investment. So those have kind of gotten delayed or slightly pushed out. So it's not a question of whether we'll make an investment, we'll probably make an investment, but it's a question of kind of seeing some of those things as part of our due diligence before we make the investment.
Yeah, so I think that those are, especially the points around the life sciences side, being slightly dragged out. But and I know that quite a few companies have been struggling with getting patients for the clinical trials, or the FDA process has just dragged on because the FDA is more worried right now about the COVID-19 vaccines, and and the investments from government are at this point, or at least for the past 6 months, have really heavily focused on COVID-related technologies. And so a lot of the traditional government grants aren't coming to non-COVID type technology. So I think that certainly have been delays that maybe haven't, if it had times that have been normal, I think would have been much faster or much more different than where we are now. And James, yeah, go ahead.
I'll just add one more thing. If you think of it as a finite level of resources that are available at the FDA, a significant chunk of those from March onwards have been allocated to COVID-related stuff. So you've got folks. There is maybe not the exact same resources, but there is a resource crunch on that side as well. So it's nothing to do with the company or funding, but it's just general milestones that the company has to meet are now running into resource constraints on the external side of the grant-making organizations or the FDA. And just with COVID, they're all working remotely as well. So you're going to get a little bit of delays with asynchronous communication happening there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And James, your fund, Photon Fund, you have been one of the more active investors with I think you said 6 investments this year, 3 of them since COVID, and 2 of them had been, I guess, companies you had been talking to before COVID, and one of them was a company that you had talked after COVID started. So I'd love to get your point on how you went about those companies where there are companies that you already knew, or companies that you knew before but hadn't invested in, and then companies that you had not known at all before the pandemic, and then you got to know about them and then invested them. So what were some strategies that your fund used to make those investments and go about finding the right companies to invest in your situation?
Yeah, so I guess for the one that is more like new investment, new partnership that we haven't really met in person, it will be a good example, and we can talk about the other bucket. This bucket, I think, it still reflect to as just a previous point. This CEO is just super proactive, and they're just trying to be way creative, like the funding structure, the funding source, and format and timing. They are just trying to accommodate and propose and repropose a lot of creative idea. That's one thing. And they have been, I would say, stay true to their original idea. I think COVID could benefit for them if they really make a quick pivot, but they stay on their track. That's not I would say not every investor will agree, but we actually still agree with that kind of stay with your original idea and track. And the third thing is they are just being creative to make a connection in a more personal way. Like I mentioned, when before COVID, we have to meet in office, in pitching event, in a coffee shop or in restaurant, right? But right now we can actually meet in person. Not in person at home. Sometimes their dog or their spouse or kid might run in and just make sure that it's more informal. Still, you can build this type of a more close to in-person type of relationship and at the end of the day, we feel comfortable to make investment. And I want to add one point is that new investment that we made, usually the share size that we do usually is like 1.5 million. But because of this, we did not be impressive. So we kind of dialed down the size to be like 750K and reserve a little bit. So when things open up, we can actually put in more money. So that's a couple of things I want to mention. So that's one of example. Be very creative and proactive, right? And also trying to build more personal relationship over a room. And the other pocket is we have been engaged for a long time. We are just trying to do a lot of due diligence, and they actually make a lot of reference call, not only their vendor, but also their potential customer, and also not only for this venture, but also the past venture who have their co-founder with. Same thing, still be creative, proactive, trying to close a deal. You have to help the D at the VC to close a deal, right?
You brought up a really good point, which is I've seen many companies, who maybe earlier this year or late last year wanted to go raise 5 million or 10 million, and then have brought that number down to maybe 3 million or 5 million. So I think the size, despite there not being as many or maybe as many deals that are still happening, maybe the size of those checks have decreased from previous years or even from earlier this year, just because you haven't been able to meet them in person, so you don't know as much as you would in person. And as you mentioned, James, a lot of investors are just giving them half the check and then see how things happen, and then give the rest of it maybe later on as things progress and get better. So I think that's something that's going to be very important for companies to understand, is you don't have to go raise all the money right now. Take what you can get at this time, and then hopefully, if you make enough progress, the investors will continue investing in later on. And Aljit, your point too, many of these companies I think are getting the right valuations, as you mentioned. I think there had been a little bit of bubble with biotech. I think there's still a biotech bubble IPO with almost 40 companies going IPO this year. But I think the valuations are somewhat reasonable compared to 100 billion or 100 million, 200 million raised at 2 billion valuations. I think they're raising 30 million, 40 million in 200 million valuations. So I think that bubble in terms of pricing has to come down, to what it should be, rather than what it was maybe 5-6 years ago, where we didn't have as many IPOs, but the valuations were just skyrocketing. So I think that's very important for companies to understand.
Yeah, I've seen companies that are in the drug space still kind of getting valuations like that for their current rounds. So if you're in the right space, the right market, your value proposition hasn't changed whether COVID happened or not, because you're still targeting a particular therapy for cancer and has good promise, or you're creating a device that has a market of doctors that are waiting for that particular device. And so those things have not changed. There is some maybe delay in terms of doctors actually seeing patients for routine situations, maybe not emergency. So I think that's the one thing I would say is, like, even in life sciences and in enterprise side, what I've seen is a deferral of expenses, or not kind of just routine checkups and stuff like that, and routine stuff that if you go to a urologist, or if you go to somebody else as a routine, all of those have kind of slowed down or stopped to some extent. So companies that are not targeting essential stuff have seen what I call this deferral or a delay in their customer spending. So enterprise spending is down. Travel as a whole industry is pretty much decimated. So if you are focusing on the travel, meetings, enterprise travel space, you're really rethinking your business plan, your business forecast. So part of raising your money, if your expected raise was based on pre-COVID numbers, you're not seeing those kind of forecasts in terms of revenue and travel or anything else. So the funding level also doesn't need to be that high until something happens. To your point, to James' point, like you do some of the money because the revenue isn't there.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree. I think it really just depends on the company, their entire market, how it's affected now or later. So no, I think that's a very important insight. So I think we're almost to the end of our time. So I really appreciate both of your insights. I think all the companies that are presenting at Demo Day, they'll at least take something out of this. conversation about how investors are thinking right now and how they can strategize, coming and talking to angel investors or VCs, depending on their rounds. So thank you again for your time. I'm sure it would be a very valuable panel for all of our companies and on our demo day. And really appreciate you taking your time off your busy schedules to give us your advice on how to steer through this pandemic and how to raise money when many companies are struggling to get through.
Keep up the hard work to every company that's out there. Thank you for this time, but I wish all the companies my best and do well.
Yeah, similar thing. Be proactive, be creative, and try to embrace this uncertainty. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Best of luck to all the companies presenting, and I'll talk to you all soon.